Welcome back to my channel. I'm Emily, and today we're going to go through all my July spreads in my reading journal, set up my July stats, and set up my August intro page. Jumping right in, the first book I finished in July was Deep End by Ali Hazelwood. This is a contemporary romance book about a competitive swimmer and a competitive diver in college who have always had a bit of an attraction, but begin to engage in a relationship when they find out some very specific things that they have in common. I didn't really have too much stationery that matches this book specifically, so I kind of just tried to match the cover as best as I could. I used some plaid purple background paper to match the mostly purple cover, and then I got all these different Just Girl stickers as a freebie from a stationery order a while ago. So I've started using those in most of my romance books where I can, because that's really the only place I feel like I want to use them. So I used one that somewhat matched the description of the FMC in this book. Then I also have this ocean wave, a kind of PET tape, to give this spread a bit of a watery vibe to it to tie in to swimming and diving stuff, since it is very integral to the plot and romance in this book. As far as the headers, I picked a blue to match the font color on the cover of the book. I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. I overall enjoyed it, but felt like this book was very much telling me about the relationship between these characters instead of showing me that these characters were developing feelings for each other. Next up, we have The Next Best Fling by Gabriela Gamez. This is also a contemporary romance book, which is going to be a theme this month because I read a lot of them to kick me out of my reading slump. This one is a kind of fake dating situation where the two main characters are both in love with people who are getting married to each other, and they end up in a situation where everyone involved in the wedding thinks they hooked up, and they kind of just go along with it and start actually hooking up. For decor, I didn't have too much that really went with this, so I mostly just went off the cover again. The one thing I did do was the FMC in this book is a librarian, so I used my book scrap paper that I have and also some of my book washi tape for some decor to kind of tie that in. I also almost always pick one of my heart papers to use as decoration for romance books, so I used some of that for the top of this page and just to finish the spread off with some pink galaxy washi tape to really tie into the cover. For all the headers, I went ahead and used a pink that matched the cover, just again to fully lean into that. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. I really loved the romance between the two main characters, and I loved how obsessed the MMC was with FMC, but there was quite a lot of miscommunication in this book, which I'm fairly picky about, and I would say about half of the miscommunication in this book was fully for the plot and didn't really make a ton of sense in regards to the characters. This is part of an interconnected series though, and I will definitely be reading the next one as I did really like the overall story and the characters and the romance in this one. Moving along to the next page, we have The Bride Test by Helen Wong. This is the second book in the interconnected Kiss Quotient series. Again, for my decor, I mostly just went with the vibes on the cover. I generally have a hard time picking out individual things to go along with the plot in more contemporary books in general, but especially with romance books. I picked out this yellow and orange plaid scrap paper to use in the background, and again picked one of these girl stickers that loosely matched the description of the FMC. I also decided to use some more of the book washi tape because the FMC in this book is going to school throughout most of the book to get her diploma, as she had a daughter when she was pretty young and is also a Vietnamese immigrant who comes to the US at the very beginning of the book, so she doesn't have any kind of education that translates to the US. I also added the little map in, since the FMC, being a Vietnamese immigrant, is a pretty big part of the premise and setup of the book. For the headers, I again just picked something that matched the cover. I debated going with the pink to match the title on the cover, but decided the yellow would go better with the decor that I ended up picking. I ended up giving this book 4.5 stars, and it ended up being my favorite in the Kiss Quotient series. I really loved the way grief was explored in this book, but my one issue with this book was the way the FMC's daughter was handled, as she felt much more like a plot device than an actual character. Next up, I read Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. This is a nonfiction book about the language used by cults, and the podcast Sounds Like a Cult, which is also hosted by Amanda Montel, is loosely based on this book. For decor, I used my book scrap paper. It's kind of become the default for nonfiction books to include this since I don't really have any other stationery stuff that goes with nonfiction specifically. I also pulled out some markers that generally matched the squiggle shapes in the cover and somewhat recreated those to add some more decoration instead of just having the book paper. For the headers, I decided to do black and try and match the font on the cover somewhat. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. It was much more surface level than I was expecting and actually went into language a lot less than I was anticipating, which was a bit disappointing. I also hated the way the audiobook narrator decided to read this book, as the tone of the text and the tone of the narrator did not match at all for the majority of the book. Then I finished out the Kiss Quotient series with The Heart Principle. For the decor on this one, I went with some heart scrap paper, but also decided to pull out a washi tape I have that has some sheet music on it, as the FMC in this book is a classical musician. And a pretty big part of the premise and setup of this book is her trying to overcome a mental block that is preventing her from playing music after she has a pretty big viral moment and gets anxiety around playing. I also used this city skyline PET tape, as in the first half of the book, there is a lot of walking around the city and exploring the city. For the font, I ended up picking a darker pinky red that matched the cover, and I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. I really, really wanted to love this book, but there is quite a big disconnect in the plot of the first half of the book and the plot of the second half of the book. And I just thought they were so distinct and separate that they should have been 2 separate books and did not mesh well together at all, even though I enjoyed the themes and characters we were exploring in each segment. Then we have Out of the Woods by Hannah Bonham Young, which takes place in the same universe as Out on a Limb, so I highly recommend reading that one first if you're planning to read either of these. This book is about a very established couple. They've been together for a long time and married for, I think, over a decade, but they're having some trouble navigating how to grow together in their relationship with having been together for so long. So they go on an outdoor hiking, camping couples retreat to try to resolve their issues. For the decor, I used some outdoor plant type paper, and there's also some really sweet scenes in this book of the characters writing little letters to each other. So I also added this postcard letter kind of thing as well. Again, I used one of the girl stickers that generally matched the description of the FMC in this book to try to use it up and just add a little something extra. For the headers, I mixed it up a little bit. For the format, source, genre, and representation headers, I used a black brush pen to match the font of the title on the cover of this book. And for my rating system and quote headers, I used a blue to add a bit more color to the page. I ended up originally giving this book 2.5 stars, but then I came back and bumped it up to 3 stars after I'd sat with it a bit because I felt like it deserved that extra half star. My main issue with this book was just that so much unnecessary filler was added to this book to pad it out into a full-length novel when it really should have just been a novella. There were a bunch of flashback scenes added that didn't really add anything to the character development or story and just repeated things that we were already learning in the main story and timeline. And the ending conflict of this book was so dramatic and over the top and had nothing to do with the characters really, and had no stakes at all because you knew everything would be fine in the end, and the characters had already resolved all their issues by then anyway, so it was really just an added conflict to pad out the length of the book. Again, this really should have just been a novella, and I think if it had been a novella, I probably would have rated it like 4, 4.5, 5 stars, because I really, really enjoyed the main part of the book, but just not the weird filler things that were added in to pad out the length. Next up, I read There by Tommy Orange for the traveling book club I'm in. This is a literary fiction book that follows a variety of interconnected characters who are all going to the big Oakland powwow. For the stationery for this one, I mostly just matched the cover and used some orange and yellow plaid scrap paper along with this orange cloud PET sticker. I also added this film reel PET tape because one of the characters in this book is working on a documentary, and a couple of the other characters do interviews for this documentary, and it's kind of, besides the powwow, the most continuous through line, I would say. For the headers, I just picked an orange marker, as that's really the only color on this cover, and the clouds and some of the stationery skewed a bit more yellow than orange, so I wanted to balance it back out with the cover. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed the overall story and format, but the ending was somewhat abrupt, and there were a few of the characters that I felt really didn't add anything to the story or the themes, and it kind of felt like we were wasting time that we could have focused on other characters or the ending on those characters. But I overall thought this was a really strong debut and will definitely be checking out other books by Tommy Orange. Then I read First Time Caller by B.K. Borison, which is a contemporary romance about a radio show host and a mother whose kid calls into the radio show to get dating advice for her mom. For the stationery, I picked out a floral orange and pink paper along with an orange geometric paper to kind of match the colors on the cover. I also added another one of the PET cloud stickers, but this one is much more colorful. It has purple and pink and blue and some hints of orange and yellow, just to add to the cover again. I also added another one of these girl stickers since this is, again, a contemporary romance, and they've kind of just become my default for contemporary romances a bit. For the fonts, I used this pink that ended up being a bit brighter than I wanted. I was hoping it would be a bit paler to match like the pale pinks on the cover, but well, I ended up giving this book 4 stars. I generally liked the romance and how it developed, and I really loved our 2 MCs, but I wish we would have gotten a bit more exploration of our MMC, and also a lot of the side characters weren't very full characters, and I wished they'd have been a bit more autonomous and less characters that just existed for the plot. Next up, I read Diavola by Jennifer Thorne. This is a horror book that takes place in an Italian villa in a fairly secretive town, and the villa has very haunted ghost vibes. For the stationery, I used this gothic dark paper with roses on it as the base. I also got a bunch of these washi stickers that have famous paintings on them, and decided to pull those out and use a couple of those because the main character in this book is an artist, and there are several parts of the book that are fairly focused around studying and examining artwork. I also used this black lace PET tape to layer with the gothic paper and the couple of artwork stickers. For the headers, I used a dark red to match with the cover of the book. I also decided for this book not to add a quotes section because I didn't really keep track of the quotes in this book because it was an audiobook, first of all, and second of all, because I ended up really not loving it. I ended up giving this book 2.5 stars, and honestly, most of the reasons this didn't get a worse rating was because the atmosphere in this book, when we were in the Italian villa, was impeccable, but all of the elements besides the atmosphere were pretty poorly executed, in my opinion. The characters were really flat, and I didn't understand any of their motivations, and all of the horror elements and story were very, very predictable and nothing I haven't seen before. So by the time I got to the end of the book, I just kind of felt like I'd wasted my time reading it a little bit. Finally, the last book I read in July was The Stand-In by Lily Chu, which is once again a contemporary romance book. This one follows our FMC shortly after she's been fired from her job when she's approached by an actress who surprisingly looks exactly like her and is asked to pretend to impersonate the actress for public appearances for the next few months so the actress can try to deal with her mental health. For the decor, I decided to layer some pink and blue plaid papers to kind of mirror the split colors in the cover. I also added another sticker girl just to add a little something else to this page yet again. I also used some heart paper in the top right to get a little more on this page. For the headers, I decided to use this really light pale blue, and I also went in with a black fine tip pen to add some shadowing just to make it a bit easier to read because this blue didn't stand out from the page as much as I thought it would. I ended up giving this book 3 stars, and I should have honestly not added the quotes section for this page either, but I didn't realize until after I'd already set it up that I didn't really have any quotes for this book that I wanted to keep track of. I thought this book was fine, but it was very overly trope-driven, and because it was so heavily reliant on the tropes, I feel like we didn't really get to know any of the other characters outside of the FMC, and really got to know her because we were in her head, which in turn made the romance feel fairly surface level, even though it was supposed to be pretty deep. On to my July stats pages. I always try to make these match the cover of the page as closely as possible, which for this month you saw at the beginning of the video, but you'll also see when I flip back through all the pages, was like a tea kettle with some flowers in it and some hand holding it. And the font that I used was this bouncy brush lettering font. And so I decided to copy that over here. And then I also decided to use the flowers being all of the dots, which ended up just being the dot in the I in ratings and the dot in the J in July. For the colors, I ended up using the colors of the flowers and tea kettle and liquid and such from the cover page that weren't also used in the font, which ended up being green, pink, light blue, and a navy. I usually don't add too much art to the stats pages or else it starts feeling really busy and overwhelming. And this one already had quite a lot of different colors, so I decided not to really add anything else. Anyways, onto my actual stats for the month. I read 10 books in July, which were comprised of approximately 921,888 words. The word count for one of my books wasn't in the website that I usually use to approximate my word count, so I just had to take my best rounded guess for that one. Those words spanned 2,876 pages and 1,112 audio minutes. I ended up switching this month to list my favorite and least favorite book of the month instead of listing the longest and shortest book. So my favorite book was The Bride Test and my least favorite book was Diavola. For format, I read 6 digital, 2 audio, and 2 physical. All 10 of the books were adult, which is getting to be pretty standard for me, so I might end up swapping this graph for something else next month. We shall see. For diversity and representation, 2 of the books had Southeast Asian main characters. One of the books had East Asian main characters. One of the books had a Latina main character. One of the books had Indigenous main characters. 3 of the books had neurodivergent main characters. 3 of the books had main characters with emotional or psychiatric disabilities. And 1 of the books had an M-spec main character. As far as genre, I read mainly contemporary romance with 7 books. Then I read 1 book each of literary fiction, nonfiction, and horror. For ratings, 1 book got 2.5 stars, 3 books got 3 stars, 2 books got 3.5 stars, 3 books got 4 stars, and 1 book got 4.5 stars. For the author breakdown this month, 1 of the books was written by a man and 9 of the books were written by women. 4 of the books were written by white authors, 2 of the books were written by a Southeast Asian author, 1 of the books was written by an East Asian author, 1 of the books was written by a Jewish author, 1 of the books was written by a Latina author, and 1 of the books was written by an Indigenous author. And that is all the reading stats I have for July. On to my August intro page. August is my birthday month. And I almost always, for the entire time I've been doing journaling stuff in any format, whether that's my reading journal or when I used to bullet journal, I pretty much always do something celestial related. I've done space and planets and astronauts and galaxies and stars, pretty much anything you can think of that ties into a celestial theme in some way. So since I wanted to keep up with that and I'm very lightly inspiring each one of my intro pages this year after a different tarot card just for a bit of a challenge, this month I decided to go with the star card. So the main focal point of this intro spread is going to be a star. For the general layout of this spread, I'm doing this woman reaching up into this kind of exploding galaxy with many stars. And there will be 1 main star that she's kind of reaching towards. The first thing I set off to do was get all of my line work and coloring with markers out of the way so that I can eventually move into paint for all the sky stuff. Since I do celestial stuff for my August themes pretty much always, I also almost always end up using watercolor because I just feel like it's the best way to capture kind of a galaxy thing, and I almost always end up with like a galaxy something on my spreads. I ended up going with this pale periwinkle blue for the dress, and it did some light gray with a bit of a darker gray layered over to add dimension for the hair. You may think this color palette looks slightly familiar, and you would probably be correct. In addition to making this all celestial, after I drew the art, I was looking at it and I realized it was almost giving me Howl's Moving Castle energy, when the stars are falling and Sophie is watching that whole scene unfold. So I decided to give the woman the same colors as Sophie, and also ended up doing the stars in a much more colored way than I usually would have done, as you'll see later. Once all the line work and mark coloring was done, I went in with watercolors to fill in the background of the exploding galaxy portion. I started out by going in and painting the whole area with a pretty saturated medium blue just so I could block out the whole section. I then went in and layered some lighter teal and pinks and purples in a couple of places to give this area a bit of dimension, but I didn't want it to be like a full galaxy, just a faraway galaxy kind of feel. While that was drying, I mixed up a navy color with my gouache to be the rest of the sky and painted that in, to really add the separation between the galaxy kind of sky and the regular sky. All the regular sky and the woman I put within a rectangular border, while the galaxy sky is pushing out beyond the confines of that border. Once the paint was all dry, I went in with a gold paint pen to do the main star, which also has the most points of all the stars I did for this piece and is much bigger than the rest of the stars. I then went in with a variety of paint pens in pastel colors and added in more traditional doodle style stars all over the galaxy area, which are all more within the star color palette in Howl's Moving Castle, where I probably typically would have just done white and metallics for the stars. So I added in a bunch of stars in those other colors and added some dots as well. And then also went in with my silver and gold paint pens as well to just make everything a little more metallic, so it wasn't just the star that was that metallic gold color. Then I went in with my gold paint pen to outline the rectangular border just on the irregular night sky areas to add a little extra definition to the outside, to really again add to the fact that the galaxy area is really breaking free of the confines of this page. I did then just go back in and trace over all my line work again to make sure all the lines were on top of the paint everywhere. At this point, I moved on to the left side of the page to set up my calendar in my typical format. This is another one of those months that technically has 6 weeks covered in it. So I did just the first 30 days on this page, and then the 31st will go on the September calendar page. I decided to use the same color I used for the dress for the numbers of the calendar, and finally went back to the main page to add the August title, which I did using the gold paint pen and just did a pretty simple cursive and added in some thicker downstrokes as well. And finally, here's a flip through of all my July pages, including the cover page and also my August intro page. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.